What if I told you there once was a little girl in a town hidden deep in the hills of Kentucky who learned very early that silence was her only way to survive? What if I told you that this girl grew up believing that love was something that only happened in books, and that her own mother, the only person who might have saved her, left her behind forever? My name is Helen Ruth Callahan. I'm 78 years old, and today I'm going to open a wound that never fully healed. I live in Harlan, Kentucky, a quiet corner of America where the roads are still lined with gravel, where neighbors know each other's names, where time moves slowly. But my story was never quiet. From the moment I was old enough to understand, I knew how to hide. I didn't play like the other girls. I didn't run with ribbons in my hair or dream of dolls. I learned early how to read the sound of my father's boots on the porch, how to tell if that day would bring shouting or worse. I learned not to speak, not to cry, not to exist. My house was never a home. It was a sealed box where screams echoed off the walls. My mother, Delilah, was a tired woman, like her soul had packed up and left long before I was born. And my father, Franklin, was cold, alcoholic, the kind of man who didn't know how to love, only how to command. When he came home and tossed his keys on the table, I froze. That sound was the start of the storm. I remember once, I was 5, I saw my mother holding a small cloth bag, trying to sneak out the back door. I was lying in bed, not sleeping. I watched her from under the blanket, my heart pounding. I wanted to ask her, "Where are you going?" I wanted to say, "Take me with you," but I couldn't speak. The fear sealed my throat, and she left, but not for long. My father caught her, dragged her back, and that was the last time she tried to run. Something inside her went dark after that. I grew up thinking that was my fate, that love wasn't meant for me, that tenderness was a luxury for other families. When I walked through town and saw other mothers brushing their daughters' hair with kindness, I felt something hollow inside, a quiet ache. Will my mother ever look at me like that? I wondered. But my mother's eyes were always somewhere far away, as if she had already left her body behind. And I made myself invisible. I became a shadow. I learned to walk without making noise, to hide under the table when the yelling started, to hold my breath so I wouldn't disturb the air. I dreamed that one day someone would see me, that someone would say, "That little girl needs help," but no one did. At school, my teachers saw the sadness in my eyes, the silence I wore like a second skin, but no one ever asked the questions out loud. One time, my reading teacher, Mrs. Bowers, took my hands in hers and asked softly, "Is everything okay at home, Helen?" I swallowed hard. I felt for a second that I could tell the truth, but my voice failed me. I just nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She sighed, stroked my hair. "If you ever need someone, I'm here." But I never went to her, because fear weighs more than promises. I learned that no one was coming to save me, that if I was going to survive, I'd have to do it alone. So the shy girl I was turned into someone who no longer cried, someone who pretended not to feel, someone who, even when everything hurt, looked in the mirror and promised herself, "One day I'll leave, one day I'll be free." But that day never came. And meanwhile, I wrote. I wrote in old notebooks passed down from school. I made up stories about girls who could fly, about mothers who rescued their daughters from dark towers. It was my only escape, the only place where I had control, where I didn't feel like I was losing my mind. One day my mother caught me writing. She took the notebook from my hands and flipped through it confused. "This won't help you, child," she said, not cruelly, but like someone who had lost all hope, like maybe once she too had dreamed and had it taken from her. But I didn't want to give up. Writing was the only thing that kept me alive. I clung to those pages like they were rope, until the day my father found one of my notebooks. He didn't read it. He tore it, page by page. Right in front of me, something broke that day. And not just paper. And my mother, she just stood there, her face empty. She said nothing, just watched. That night, I knew I wasn't the only one who had had enough, and what a woman does when she's had enough. That I would learn soon. But when it happened, it wasn't like in the movies. There were no emotional speeches, no dramatic goodbyes. It was something quiet, quick, and irreversible. But that I'll tell later. If you're still with me now, I want to ask you, where are you watching from? Leave a comment and let me know, because it matters to me. Because I want to know this story is reaching far, that someone out there, somewhere, is listening. And if my story touched something in you, I ask you to like this video, to subscribe, and to share it. Because telling this story isn't easy, but maybe, somehow, it can help someone else. And me? I've learned that sometimes sharing pain is the only way to move forward. Life went on. and I remained in that house that never felt like a home. Every day was a quiet war, a test of endurance. I knew the sound of my father's boots when he came home drunk. I could smell the air and tell whether that night would be quiet or if hell would come back inside those walls. I learned to read my mother's glances, always filled with sadness and fear. I saw when she wanted to protect me, but I also saw the helplessness in her eyes. She was a prisoner in that life, just like me. The only difference was I still had hope. The years went by, and I grew older. But inside, the frightened little girl was still there. I became quiet, withdrawn. I was good at disappearing. When my father was in a bad mood, I would curl up in corners of the house, become invisible. I learned not to make noise, not to draw attention, because attention meant pain. When I was 7, I realized something that stayed with me for life. Silence was also a shield. When you don't talk, when you don't complain, when you don't cry, no one sees your pain. And when no one sees it, no one can use it against you. My mother looked tired all the time, her eyes swollen, her face marked by a life she never chose. Some nights she would sit at the edge of my bed, silent. I knew she wanted to say something, maybe an apology, maybe a warning, but she never did. And it was around then that I started dreaming of escape. But that too I'll share in the next chapter. I remember the day I stopped believing in rescue. I was 6. It was early spring in Harlem, and the woods behind our house were just starting to show green again. I had this little hiding place under an old oak tree near the edge of the field, a spot where I used to run when the voices inside got too loud. That day, the yelling between my parents began before sunrise. I hadn't even gotten out of bed when I heard the first crash, a bottle maybe, or a plate, something fragile meeting the wall. I covered my ears under the covers, but it didn't help. I knew what would come next. My father's voice was like gravel dragged across pavement, rough, mean, unpredictable. I didn't understand all his words, but I understood the rage. And my mother, Delilah, she had learned how to endure it. She had that faraway look on her face most of the time, like she'd packed her soul in a suitcase and left her body behind. I think she had to, just to survive. That morning, I slipped out through the back door without making a sound. I knew how to walk so the boards wouldn't creak. I practiced. I didn't wear shoes. My bare feet on the cold porch reminded me I was still here, still real. The air smelled like rain, and the birds were just starting to chirp. I ran across the field, my nightgown snagging on the brush, until I reached my tree. And there, beneath its roots, I hid for hours. I listened to the wind move through the branches, trying to match its rhythm with my breath. I imagined I was a fox, or a bird, or something small and quiet and free. But even then, my imagination had its limits, because no matter how far I let my mind wander, I still heard the echoes from the house, the rage that found its way across the field, like smoke. That day was when I realized something awful. No one was coming. No neighbor, no teacher, no family. I was alone in this, entirely. And if I wanted to survive, I had to learn how to disappear, inside myself. When I finally came back home that afternoon, my father was passed out on the couch. A cigarette dangled from his hand, still burning into the carpet. My mother was in the kitchen, sweeping up broken glass with her bare hands. Blood ran down her palm, but she didn't seem to notice. When she saw me, she didn't say anything, just looked. I'll never forget her eyes. Red, swollen, empty. "Where were you?" she asked. Not angry, not worried, just hollow. "I was playing," I whispered. She nodded but didn't ask more. We never talked about what happened inside those walls. We never gave it names, and maybe that's what hurt the most. Not the bruises, not the fear, but the silence. The way pain became the wallpaper of our home. Normal, expected. School became my second hiding place. But even there, I was different, quieter, distant. I didn't laugh with the other girls. I didn't share secrets or braid hair at recess. I kept to myself. I always had a book in hand. And not because I loved stories, though I did, but because reading gave me a place to escape to. A world where fathers didn't scream and mothers didn't flinch. One teacher, Mrs. Whitmore, noticed. She was kind in that soft way older women sometimes are, like she'd lived through her own storms. She once gave me a poetry book and told me to write something of my own. "Anything you want, Helen," she said. "Your words matter." I took that book home like it was treasure. That night, after my parents had gone to bed, I wrote my first poem. It wasn't good. It was clumsy and simple and raw, but it was mine. It came from a place in me I didn't know I had access to, a place not broken. Writing became my salvation. I wrote about trees and animals and stars, but eventually the poems changed. I wrote about girls hiding under tables, about mothers with glass in their palms, about the sound of boots on wooden floors. I wrote truths I couldn't speak, and then I began to fear that someone would find my notebook, that they would read my truths and punish me for them. So I started hiding my words in the lining of my pillow, inside the old Bible we never opened, behind loose bricks in the fireplace. My poems were like pieces of me, scattered across the house like forgotten prayers. Sometimes I dreamed that someone would find them and understand me, that they'd knock on our door one day and say, "We read her words. We know what's happening here." But no one ever did. When I was 9, something happened that changed everything. It was a Sunday. My father had gone to town, and my mother took me to church alone. We didn't go often, only when she was trying to pretend. That day, the preacher spoke about obedience, about women knowing their place, about fathers being the shepherds of the home. I remember sitting on that wooden pew, my legs swinging above the floor, my hands clenched in fists, and I hated it. Not the church, not even the preacher, but the lie of it all. Afterward, we stayed for coffee in the basement. My mother was speaking to a group of women, laughing softly like she hadn't bled the day before, like she wasn't trapped. And that was when I saw her, the preacher's wife. She wore a blue dress with lace trim, and she smiled at everyone. But when her husband passed behind her, she flinched, just for a second. But I saw it. It was the first time I realized we weren't the only ones. Pain wears many dresses. I started paying attention after that. At school, at church, in town. I saw signs everywhere. Women with quiet eyes, girls with nervous smiles, boys who didn't look anyone in the eye. And it made me angry. Angry that we were all pretending. But I kept pretending too, because I was a child. And in our world, children don't get to tell the truth. By the time I turned 10, I had mastered the art of invisibility. My father barely looked at me. My mother barely spoke. We were 3 ghosts living under one roof. And I wrote. Oh, how I wrote. Stories, poems, letters to a God I didn't believe in. I asked him why I was born into this, why he gave me a voice and then told me to shut it down, why he made me feel so much if I wasn't allowed to speak. I never got answers, but I kept writing, because even when no one reads it, the act of writing says, I exist, I'm here, this is my pain, and it matters. I didn't know it then, but I was building the courage I would need one day, because the worst was still coming. And one night, when the storm finally broke, and it did, my words would be the only thing that saved me. But that, I'll tell in the next chapter. It was a Wednesday afternoon in early autumn when everything changed. I was 10 years old, sitting on the back porch with a tattered notebook in my lap and a broken pencil between my fingers. The air smelled like dying leaves and wood smoke, and for a few rare minutes, the house was quiet. My father was still at work, and my mother was hanging sheets out to dry on the clothesline. I remember watching her hands move, delicate and automatic, like they were doing the work without her mind present. I was writing something I probably shouldn't have written, a story about a girl named Clara who hid behind the furnace every time her father came home. I didn't even change the name of the town. Harlan was right there on the page. Maybe I was tired of pretending. Maybe some small part of me wanted to be found out. When my father's truck pulled into the gravel driveway, I flinched so hard my pencil snapped in two. I shoved the notebook under the porch floorboard, a loose plank I had discovered months earlier, and stood up fast, brushing the dirt off my dress like nothing had happened. But he saw me. He always saw me. He slammed the door of his truck, lit a cigarette, and looked right at me with those dead blue eyes of his. "Why aren't you helping your mother?" he asked. I didn't answer. I didn't know what the right answer was. Helping too much made me noticeable. Helping too little made me lazy. Either way, I would pay. He stepped onto the porch, flicked his cigarette into the yard, and without a word, smacked the back of my head hard enough to make me stumble forward. "Useless," he muttered as he pushed past me. My mother didn't say a word. She never did. She just lowered her eyes and went back to pinning the sheets like they were the only thing she could control. That night, after everyone was asleep, I crawled out of bed and tiptoed to the porch. My heart was pounding. I lifted the floorboard and took out the notebook. My fingers trembled as I turned the pages. I needed to know the story was still there, that Clara still existed, that I still existed, but the notebook wasn't there. Only scraps, torn pages. Someone had found it. The next morning, my father didn't speak to me. He didn't have to. He just tossed what was left of the notebook onto the kitchen table like a corpse. My mother looked at it, then at me. Her face didn't change, just that same faraway look, but I saw her hand tremble. "You think you're a writer now?" my father said, voice calm but laced with poison. "Think you can make up lies about your own family?" I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. No defense, no apology, nothing. I was frozen. He grabbed my arm hard and dragged me to the back of the house, opened the wood stove. "If you ever write one more word," he said, "this is what'll happen." And he dropped the notebook in. I watched the flames devour it, watched my only voice burn. That was the day my childhood ended. After that, I didn't write again, not for a long time. I stopped speaking in class. I stopped looking people in the eye. I became a shell, something that moved and breathed but didn't feel. My mother tried to reach me once, a week later maybe. I was sitting at the table peeling an apple, and she sat across from me. "You have to stop dreaming, Helen," she whispered. "Dreams only hurt more when they die." I looked up at her, hoping for something. Love, recognition, regret, but she wasn't really there. She never had been, and I believed her. I buried my dreams with the ashes of that notebook. At school, I was the quiet girl in the back row, the one who never raised her hand, the one who flinched when the teacher called her name. I stopped reading poetry. I stopped drawing. I stopped imagining other lives, because none of them included me. Then, in the middle of 7th grade, something unexpected happened. A new girl moved to town. Her name was Lydia Carson. She had curly red hair, freckles, and a laugh that could crack glass. She didn't care what anyone thought of her. She wore mismatched socks and wrote her name on everything in pink marker, and for some unfathomable reason, she chose me. "Hi," she said on her first day, plopping down next to me in the cafeteria. "You look like someone who hates lunch as much as I do." I stared at her. "I don't hate lunch," I mumbled. "Okay, fine," she said, grinning. "But you don't love it either. I can tell." And just like that, she was my friend. I didn't trust it at first. I thought it was a joke, a trap, that someone had put her up to it. But Lydia was persistent. She sat with me every day. She passed me notes in class. She asked me questions like she actually wanted the answers. And for the first time in years, I laughed. Really laughed. One afternoon, she came over to my house. My mother met her at the door, stiff and confused. I told her Lydia was a school project partner. That was the only way she'd allow it. We sat on the back porch, and Lydia pulled out a notebook of her own. "I write stories," she said proudly. I froze. "Want to read one?" she asked. I hesitated, then nodded. The story was silly and beautiful and ridiculous. It was about a mermaid who rode a motorcycle and battled giant seagulls. I laughed until my stomach hurt. Then she handed me a blank notebook. "Here, for you, just in case." I didn't write in it that night, but I didn't throw it away either. Over the next few months, Lydia became my anchor. She didn't ask about my bruises. She didn't push me to talk. She just made me feel normal, like maybe I wasn't invisible after all. She told me I was smart, that I was funny, that I had a beautiful mind. And slowly I started to believe her. Not completely, but enough to begin again. One night I waited until the house was silent. I lit a candle and opened the notebook she gave me, and I wrote, "My name is Helen Ruth Callahan, and I am still here." That was all. But it was enough. It was a beginning. And I would need that beginning soon, because storms were still ahead, and some of them would nearly destroy me. But Lydia, she had given me a seed, and even in darkness, seeds remember how to grow. By the time I turned 13, I had mastered the art of silence. I spoke when spoken to. I smiled when expected. I kept my eyes low and my voice even. I had become the kind of girl no one remembered at the end of the day. And in a house like mine, that was the safest place to be. But even silence has limits. And that year, mine was shattered. The change began with Lydia. She was still my only friend, still the only person who made me feel visible. We would sit under the trees behind the school, writing in our notebooks. Her stories were wild and full of color. Pirates and dragons and girls who ruled kingdoms. Mine were quieter, poems mostly, small and sad like whispers on paper. But she read them all, and she never laughed. "You write like your soul's been cracked open," she told me once. I didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever called my soul anything before. At home, things were getting worse. My father had been drinking more. His anger, once unpredictable, had become routine. There was a schedule to his cruelty now. Monday nights, he threw things. Wednesday mornings, he insulted our clothes, our hair, our very breath. Saturdays were the worst. On Saturdays, he didn't yell. He whispered, and those whispers were knives. My mother had grown even quieter, if that was possible. She moved through the house like a ghost. Her eyes always focused on something I couldn't see. She had given up long before I was born. Now she was just waiting for her body to catch up with her spirit. One night, I was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when he came in. He'd been at the bar again. I could smell the whiskey on his breath before he even spoke. He looked at my books, then at me. "Think you're better than us?" he slurred. "Think you're gonna write your way out of here?" I didn't answer, but he wasn't looking for an answer. He picked up my math book and threw it across the room. Papers flew like birds startled from a tree. "Say something," he shouted. My heart pounded, but I kept my voice steady. "I was just doing my homework." He stepped closer. Liar. My mother didn't move. She never moved. He grabbed the back of my neck and slammed my head down on the table. I saw stars. Not the kind in the sky, the kind that live behind your eyes. When he finally let go, I ran. Out the back door, across the yard, into the woods. I didn't stop until my lungs were burning, and then I screamed. Not words, just sound, raw and animal. I screamed until my throat gave out, and then I collapsed. I don't remember how long I lay there, but when I opened my eyes, Lydia was there. She must have followed me. She didn't say anything. She just sat beside me and held my hand. The next day, she gave me a new notebook. It had a blue cover and smelled like lavender. "I want you to write in this," she said, "but only the truth." "I don't know the truth," I whispered. "Yes, you do," she said. "You've just been trained to forget it." So I did. That night I wrote the truth. I wrote about my father, about his hands and his voice and his fists. I wrote about my mother's silence, about the bruises we both pretended didn't exist, about the way the house felt colder every year. And once I started, I couldn't stop. I wrote until the candle burned out, and then I kept writing in the dark. Something inside me had broken open, and in that breaking, I found a kind of light. At school, things started to shift. Teachers noticed I was more alert. I raised my hand in class. I got A's. Mrs. Whitmore, the poetry teacher, pulled me aside one afternoon. "You've changed," she said. I didn't know how to explain it, so I just said, "I started telling the truth." She nodded, like she understood. That spring, she entered one of my poems into a statewide contest without telling me. 2 months later, I won, first place. There was a ceremony in Louisville. My mother refused to go. My father didn't even know, so Lydia came with me. We sat in the front row. When they called my name, I walked to the podium in a borrowed dress and trembling knees, and I read my poem. My voice shook, but I didn't stop. When I finished, the room was quiet, and then they clapped. Not polite clapping, real clapping, like I mattered. Afterward, a woman from the local newspaper asked to interview me. She wanted to know where I learned to write like that. I didn't know what to say, so I lied. "I just like stories," I said, because the truth still felt too dangerous. When I got home that night, I hid the trophy under my bed. I didn't want my father to see it, but he did. 2 days later, he found it while searching for a belt. When I came home from school, it was in pieces on the floor, and he was waiting. "I told you," he said. "No more lies." That night, I bled a lot, and something inside me finally snapped. The next morning, I went to the school counselor, and for the first time in my life, I told an adult everything. I told him about the bruises, the slamming, the burning, the silence. I told him about the nights I slept with a knife under my pillow, just in case. He listened. He wrote things down. He made phone calls. And that evening, a woman from Child Protective Services came to our house. She was gentle, kind, and when she asked if I wanted to leave, I said yes. My mother didn't stop me. She didn't cry. She just looked at me like I was already gone, like I had always been gone. That night I packed a bag, 2 shirts, a notebook, a pen, and the broken trophy. We drove away in a gray sedan. The town faded behind us like a dream or a nightmare. I was placed with a foster family in a nearby county. They were nice, quiet. They let me keep the door open at night. They let me write. They let me be. And for the first time, I started to believe I might survive. But healing isn't linear, and the past doesn't disappear just because you drive away from it. It follows you. It whispers to you in your sleep. It waits for you in quiet moments. And eventually, I would have to face it again, but not yet. For now, I was safe, and that was enough to breathe, to write, to begin. Foster homes are strange places. They're quiet in the way empty churches are quiet. Too still, too clean, too full of things that don't belong to you. The wardens, my first foster family, were kind people. Carol and Raymond. She worked at the library, and he was a retired postman with crooked glasses and soft shoes that barely made a sound when he walked across the hardwood floors. They gave me my own room, my own bed, my own toothbrush. I had never had anything that was only mine before, but I didn't know what to do with safety. I didn't know how to sleep without fear. I'd lie awake every night, staring at the ceiling fan, expecting footsteps, expecting the sound of a belt being pulled from a loop, expecting my name to be shouted like a curse. But those sounds never came. Instead, Carol would knock gently on the door and ask if I needed anything. Warm milk, a book, a night light. I didn't answer at first. I didn't know how to answer. But after 2 weeks, I whispered, "A book." She brought me one, Little Women. It was too cheerful, too full of girls who laughed and loved and dreamed without fear. But I read it anyway and cried for every chapter because I didn't understand that kind of life and because a part of me wanted it so badly it hurt. School was different now. I went to Harlan County High, a bigger school with new teachers and students who didn't know my name, didn't know what I had survived. I could have been anyone there, but instead I became no one. I walked through the hallways like a ghost, keeping my head down, answering only when called, except in English class. Mr. Benton was the kind of teacher who didn't just teach literature. He believed it could save lives. He wore corduroy blazers and always smelled like coffee and chalk. He gave us an assignment one day. Write a personal essay titled "A Moment That Changed You." I didn't want to, but the words came anyway. I wrote about the night my father burned my notebook, about the first time Lydia held my hand in silence, about the stars I saw when my head hit the kitchen table, about the broken trophy. I handed it in with shaking hands. 3 days later, Mr. Benton asked me to stay after class. "I read your essay," he said. I braced for pity, for disbelief, but he didn't offer either. "You're a writer," he said simply, "whether you want to be or not." "I don't know if I want to be anything," I replied. "That's okay," he said, "but you already are." I cried in the stairwell that day because it was the first time an adult had looked at me and seen someone worth naming. Carol and Raymond encouraged me to keep writing. They cleared out a small desk for me in the corner of the living room. They bought me pens and paper. They framed a poem of mine and hung it above the mantel. I started submitting my work to local contests. Some I won, most I didn't, but I kept writing. And slowly, my words became stronger than my memories. I still had nightmares. I still flinched when doors slammed or someone raised their voice. But the writing gave me power, control, a way to turn pain into something beautiful, something that didn't belong to my father anymore. When I was 16, Carol drove me to Louisville again. There was a summer writing program at the university. I had been accepted on scholarship. She hugged me in the parking lot. "You have a story to tell," she said, "and the world needs to hear it." I spent 6 weeks surrounded by other young writers, kids from all over the state, each carrying their own stories, their own wounds. We shared poetry over campfires. We read our essays aloud in classrooms with peeling paint and humming fluorescent lights. And for the first time, I didn't feel alone. There was a girl named Riley. She wrote about grief like it was a second language. Her brother had died in a car accident, and she said writing was the only thing that kept her breathing. One night, we sat on the dorm roof, legs dangling over the edge. "You ever want to just disappear?" she asked. "All the time," I said. "But we don't," she replied. "We write instead." That sentence stayed with me like a prayer. When the program ended, I didn't want to go home, even though home was now safe. Back in Harlan, Carol and Raymond welcomed me with open arms, but I felt distant, detached. The town looked smaller, the trees shorter, the sky heavier, and something in me had changed. I was 17 the day I saw my mother again. I was leaving the grocery store with Carol when I saw her. She looked thinner, older. Her hair had gone completely gray. She was holding a bag of bread and staring at the ground. She didn't see me, and I didn't speak. I froze in place, heart pounding, breath caught in my throat. Carol touched my arm. "Do you want to talk to her?" I shook my head. She didn't press. As we drove away, I looked back once. She was still there, still silent, still small. That night, I wrote a letter to Lydia. We had lost touch. She'd moved to Ohio the year after I entered foster care. We tried to stay in contact, but life happened, and I never really knew how to tell her all of it. So I wrote, "Dear Lydia, you saved me once, maybe more than once. You held my hand when it was shaking. You saw me when I was invisible. You gave me a notebook and told me to tell the truth. I'm still writing. I'm still telling it. I hope you are too. Love always. Helen." I never mailed it, but writing it felt like closure, or maybe the start of a new chapter, one I was finally ready to write. The next spring, I graduated high school with honors. Mr. Benton handed me my diploma and whispered, "Keep writing." Carol cried in the front row. Raymond took a blurry photo with his old film camera. I looked out at the crowd. My mother wasn't there, but I didn't feel empty. I felt full of memory, of pain, of hope, and most of all, of words. Words that were mine. Words that couldn't be burned. College was a word that used to live in other people's mouths. It didn't belong to girls like me, girls who counted ceiling tiles to fall asleep, girls who grew up learning to disappear, but suddenly it was mine. I got a full scholarship to Berea College, a quiet campus tucked into the green hills of Kentucky, far enough from Harlan to feel like a new world. Carol and Raymond drove me there in their old station wagon. Carol packed snacks and cried 3 times on the way. Raymond handed me a set of quarters for laundry and whispered, "Call us if anything goes wrong." I had never been away from them overnight. That first evening in the dorm, I sat on the narrow twin bed, surrounded by boxes, and wondered if I'd made a mistake. My roommate, Jenna, was from Lexington. Her voice was loud, confident, and full of stories about cheerleading and summer trips to Myrtle Beach. We were nothing alike, but she didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. She just handed me a bowl of instant noodles and said, "Welcome to college." The weeks passed slowly. I signed up for literature and philosophy and creative writing. I found refuge in the library, where I sat in the back corner under a crooked lamp and wrote for hours. My poems got darker, sharper. I wrote about girls with bruised voices, about mothers who faded like smoke, about houses that echoed even when they were full. Professor Abrams noticed me. She taught advanced composition and had hair like storm clouds and a stare that made you feel like she already knew your secrets. She called me into her office after reading a piece I submitted titled "The Kitchen Table." "I want you to consider publishing," she said. "Your work has teeth." Teeth. No one had ever said that before. I didn't say yes, I didn't say no either. One night in October, I woke up gasping. My dreams had dragged me back. I was 12 again, crouched under the kitchen table while glass shattered above me. My father's voice echoed through the walls like thunder. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I sat there for 2 hours in the dark, knees to chest, until the sun touched the edge of the window. The next morning, I went to the campus health center. I didn't lie. I told the nurse I had been having nightmares, flashbacks, panic attacks. She didn't blink. She handed me a pamphlet and recommended a therapist off campus. Her name was Dr. Melanie Price. I met her in a small office filled with books and plants. She had warm eyes and didn't rush me. I didn't tell her everything right away. I started with Lydia, with the blue notebook, with the poetry. Slowly, I peeled back layers I had forgotten were there. Dr. Price helped me name things I had buried, like fear and rage and grief, for the girl I had been, for the childhood I never had, for the mother I still didn't understand. There was a moment in our 5th session when she said something that changed everything. "You survived," she said. "But surviving is not the same as living." Those words hit me like a wave. Because I had been surviving for so long, I didn't know what living even meant. I started journaling again. Not just poems, memories, fragments, conversations I had only in my head, letters I never sent. I wrote one to my father. I didn't mail it. I didn't even sign it, but I wrote it, and that was enough. Sophomore year, I published a poem in a national journal. It was called Ashes and Milk. It was about breakfast and violence and forgiveness. I used a pen name, Ruth Ellen. No one on campus knew it was me, but it still felt like a victory. I called Carol to tell her. She cried again. That Thanksgiving, I went home to Harlan. Carol cooked too much food, and Raymond had painted the mailbox white. We sat around the table, and for once, the silence was gentle, safe. I asked about my mother. Carol said she still worked at the diner, still walked with her head down, still hadn't spoken about me. I didn't know what to do with that information, so I folded it up and tucked it away. In January, I was asked to speak at a campus reading. I stood at the podium, heart rattling in my ribs, and read a piece about a girl who learned to run before she learned to walk. Afterward, a boy approached me, tall, quiet, dark eyes like questions. His name was Elias. He said, "Your story sounds like a storm." I laughed. "Most days it feels like one." We talked. Then we kept talking. He wasn't pushy. He didn't flinch when I said I didn't like closed doors. He never asked about my past unless I offered it. He once told me, "You don't owe anyone the whole story." He didn't know how much I needed to hear that. The first time he kissed me, I cried. Not because I was scared, because I wasn't. And that was new and beautiful and terrifying. Dr. Price said, "You're learning to trust again." I said, "I don't know if I can." She replied, "You already are." That spring, I got another letter from the journal. They wanted to publish more of my work. I started to believe maybe I had something to offer, not just as a survivor, but as a writer, as a woman, as myself. The scars didn't disappear. They never do, but they stopped bleeding. They became stories, stories I could hold and shape and share. At the end of the semester, Elias and I sat on the campus lawn, watching the sun slide behind the mountains. He took my hand. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "So am I," I replied, and I meant it. For the first time in my life, I meant it. Senior year came faster than I expected. There's something about healing that tricks you into thinking you're ready for everything. That because you've survived the worst, everything else should be easier. But it isn't. Pain doesn't follow the rules, and neither does memory. Elias and I were still together. We had grown into each other slowly, like roots winding around the same stone. We shared long walks through town, reading dates in the cemetery, and coffee from the little shop on Main Street, where the windows always fogged up in winter. He had his own ghosts. He didn't talk much about his father, and I didn't press. We carried our wounds in silence, side by side. One afternoon, I got a call from Carol. Her voice was tight. "She's in the hospital," she said. My stomach dropped. "Who?" "Your mother." She said the words like she was afraid of what they might do to me. Apparently, my mother had collapsed at work. Dehydration, stress, nothing life-threatening. But the hospital had called her emergency contact, which was still Carol. They didn't even know I existed. I didn't know what to do with that. I went for a walk, 5 miles around campus. It was raining, but I didn't feel it. My thoughts were louder than the storm. Why had she never looked for me? Why did she leave? Why hadn't she fought? That weekend, I took a bus to Harlan. Elias offered to come with me, but I said no. This was something I had to face alone. The hospital was small and smelled like bleach and boiled vegetables. Room 206. I stood outside her door for 15 minutes before I had the courage to knock. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her skin was pale, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She was reading a magazine with shaking hands. When she looked up and saw me, she didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just stared. "Hi," I said. "Nothing." "It's me, Helen." Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. I stepped closer. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might faint. She finally spoke. "You look like your father." It felt like a slap. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came. "What do you say to the woman who gave you life and then abandoned it?" She gestured to the chair beside her bed. I sat. Silence stretched between us like a hallway with no doors. "I didn't know," she said finally. "Didn't know what?" "That he'd do those things to you." I shook my head. "You did. You had to have known." She closed her eyes. "I couldn't stop him." "But you could have left." I tried. She opened her eyes, and for the first time, I saw something break in her. Not sorrow, not shame, just exhaustion. "I had nowhere to go," she whispered. "No job, no money, no one who would take us in." "You had Carol," I said. "She was your father's cousin." I didn't trust her. "She saved me," I replied. Tears welled up in her eyes. "I used to hear you crying," she said. "At night, after he left your room. I'd lie in bed and tell myself you'd forget, that it would pass. I was weak." "You were a mother," I said, voice trembling. "That's supposed to mean something." She looked away. "I know." The nurse came in to check her vitals. I stood up. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said. "I don't expect you to. I don't even know if I want to." She nodded. I left without saying goodbye. Outside, the rain had stopped. The next day, I sat with Dr. Price and told her everything. She listened, as always. "What do you feel?" she asked. "Empty," I said, "and angry, and tired. That's a start." We talked for an hour. She said, "Forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook. It's about freeing yourself from the weight." I didn't know if I believed her, but I wanted to. Graduation was 2 months away. Elias and I planned to move to Louisville. He had a job lined up with a nonprofit. I had been accepted into a graduate program for creative writing. We packed our things into cardboard boxes, said goodbye to the campus that had saved me, took one last walk past the library, the coffee shop, the classroom where I first read my poetry out loud. At graduation, I wore a white dress under my gown. Carol cried. Raymond brought flowers. My mother didn't come, and I didn't ask why. I told myself I didn't care, but a part of me did. In Louisville, life was different, faster, busier, but I made it mine. I wrote every morning at the same diner booth, always with a black coffee and 2 slices of toast. I sent my poems to journals, chapbooks, open mics. Some were accepted, some ignored, but I kept writing. Elias worked long hours, but he came home tired and smiling, always asking what I'd written that day. We made a home out of our tiny apartment, painted the walls blue, adopted a cat named Finch, learned how to burn pasta without starting a fire. I still saw Dr. Price once a month, now over Zoom. She reminded me that healing isn't linear, that some days I'd feel like a whole person, and other days I'd feel like a house missing half its walls, but I was still standing, still writing, still loving. One evening I got a call from the hospital in Harlan. My mother had died, a stroke, sudden, quiet, alone. She had left a letter for me. Carol read it to me over the phone. It said, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope you live a life nothing like mine, a life full of noise and color and truth. I'm sorry I didn't give you that. Love, Marlene. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat on the kitchen floor holding the cat and whispered, I lived because I had, and I would keep living with the pain, with the questions, with the words. It's strange how someone can die and still take up space in every corner of your life. After my mother passed, I kept hearing her voice in places she had never been, on the porch when the wind blew, in the sound of boiling water, in the silence between my words. For a long time I wasn't sure what I was grieving, her absence or the hope that maybe one day we could have made peace. I started writing a letter I never planned to send, not to her, but to the version of me that had waited at the door years ago for a mother who never came back. I wrote, you didn't deserve what happened to you. You didn't imagine it. You weren't dramatic. You were a child. You were scared, and you survived. I read it out loud to myself once. Then I folded it into my notebook and didn't open it again. Elias noticed I'd been quieter. He didn't push. He just sat next to me on the couch while I stared at nothing, and sometimes that was all I needed. I started dreaming about the house again, the one in Harlan. In the dream, I stood in the kitchen holding a broom, sweeping up broken glass that kept appearing no matter how many times I swept. I would look up, and the walls would be covered in writing, my own poems, lines I had written years ago, bleeding down the wallpaper like ink and tears. Then I'd hear footsteps, but no one ever appeared. Dr. Price said, that house will always be part of your architecture, but it doesn't have to define the way you live now. I thought about that a lot, about what it means to carry pain, but not be ruled by it. I gave a talk at the university that spring. They invited me to speak about trauma and writing. The room was full, mostly women, mostly quiet. I told them that healing is not a staircase, it's a spiral. You come back to the same hurt in new ways, with more strength each time. Afterward, a student approached me. She said, your story sounded like mine. I nodded. You're not alone. That night, I lay in bed with Elias and stared at the ceiling, thinking about all the women who never get to tell their stories, who never find a name for their pain, who are taught to be quiet, to be small, to disappear. I refused to disappear. I started working on a manuscript, a memoir maybe just a long letter to the world. I titled it The House on Birch Street. It was part memory, part poetry, part survival guide. I didn't know if anyone would publish it, but I needed to write it anyway. Each morning, I returned to the page. I wrote about the floorboards that creaked when my father walked, about the hallway light that stayed on until he went to bed, about the way I learned to make no sound when I cried. I wrote about Carol, about her cinnamon toast, about the way she held my hand during thunderstorms, about the softness in her voice when she said, "You're safe now." I wrote about the night I told Elias the truth, how I sat on the edge of our bed and said, "There's something you should know," and how he didn't flinch, didn't interrupt, just listened. I wrote about silence, the kind that protects, the kind that destroys. I wrote about forgiveness, how it doesn't come all at once, how sometimes it never does. But that doesn't mean healing stops. It just means you learn to breathe around the wound. In July, I visited Carol. She was older now, her hands slower, her hair grayer. We sat on her porch, drinking lemonade. She said, "You look like your mother." I stiffened. "She wasn't all bad," she added gently. I didn't respond, because I didn't know if that mattered. I told her about the manuscript. She said, "You always had stories in your bones." I thanked her, not just for that, but for everything. She took my hand and said, "You're the bravest person I know." I swallowed hard, because I didn't feel brave. I felt tired. But maybe bravery isn't about feeling strong. Maybe it's just about choosing to keep going. I sent the manuscript to 5 publishers. 3 rejected it. 1 never responded. 1 said yes, they wanted to publish it, as it was. No edits, no filters, just truth, raw and unpolished. I held the acceptance letter in my hand and cried. For the girl in the attic, for the woman on the porch, for every version of me that thought this moment would never come. The book came out the following spring. I didn't do a big launch, just a reading at the library. The room was quiet, but I could feel the weight in the air, the kind of weight that comes when people recognize themselves in someone else's pain. Afterward, a woman came up to me. She was in her 60s. She said, "I never told anyone, but I know what your house feels like." I hugged her, not because I had answers, but because I understood. That's all we ever want, isn't it? To be understood, to know we're not alone in the dark. There's a moment in every survivor's life when the apology dies, when the voice that once whispered, "I'm sorry I existed," finally goes silent. For me, that moment came quietly, almost unnoticed, like the sun slipping over the ridge behind our little apartment in Louisville. But once I felt it, I knew I'd never go back. It started with small things. I stopped explaining myself to strangers. I stopped lowering my voice in rooms where others shouted. I stopped dressing to make myself invisible. I stopped shrinking to make others more comfortable. I learned to say no without trembling. I learned to sit alone in silence and not feel ashamed of the quiet. I stopped apologizing for crying, for feeling too much, for remembering things I wish I could forget. And most of all, I stopped apologizing for surviving. I had spent a lifetime managing everyone else's comfort, smiling when I was breaking, laughing at things that weren't funny, nodding when I wanted to scream. Also, no one would think I was too much. But healing made me too much anyway. Too honest, too loud, too alive. That spring, I was invited to speak at a women's conference in Chicago. I nearly turned it down. Who was I to stand in front of hundreds of women and pretend I had anything figured out? But then I remembered the girl I used to be, the one who sat alone in the back pew of a church, praying God would either save her or let her disappear. I remembered how she never saw anyone on that stage who looked like her, who sounded like her, who said the things she needed to hear. So I went. The hotel ballroom was packed. Rows of women, eyes wide, some clinging to notebooks, others clutching tissues like armor. I stood behind the microphone, hands trembling, and said, "My name is Helen Ruth Callahan. I was abused for most of my childhood by the man who was supposed to protect me, and I spent most of my adult life trying to forget it ever happened. But I'm done forgetting. I'm here to remember, not just for me, but for anyone who thought surviving meant staying silent." The room held its breath, and then they exhaled. Afterward, I stayed for hours talking to women who lined up just to say thank you. Not because I saved them, but because I reminded them they weren't alone. One woman gave me a small card with a handwritten note. It read, "Because of your words, I spoke mine. I still carry it in my wallet." Back in Louisville, things were simple. Elias and I walked to the farmer's market every Saturday. I taught a community writing class at the local library. We took road trips with no destination, sometimes ending up in towns with one stoplight and a diner that served breakfast all day. We made a life out of quiet joys. One day, I opened a letter from a small publishing house in Oregon. They wanted to translate The House on Birch Street into Spanish. Said they had readers across Latin America asking for it. I said yes without hesitation. Because truth deserves to cross borders. Because pain doesn't speak just one language. Because somewhere in a village in Peru or a city in Mexico, there's a woman who thinks her story doesn't matter, and maybe my voice can help her find her own. Later that year, I was asked to do a radio interview. The host, a kind man named Julian, asked me what I would tell my younger self if I could. I paused before answering, then said, "You're allowed to take up space. You're allowed to be loud. You're allowed to exist without apology. And most of all, you are not broken." He sat in silence for a moment, then whispered, "I think a lot of people needed to hear that." I knew I had. Fall came. The leaves in Cherokee Park turned red and gold, and the air smelled of firewood and cinnamon. I spent my mornings writing on the porch, a blanket over my knees, and Finch purring at my feet. I started a second book. This one wasn't about the past. It was about the now, about joy, about softness, about rebuilding from ruins, not with perfection, but with truth. The first chapter began. This is not a story of pain. It's a story of what grew in its shadow. Elias called it my victory song. He wasn't wrong. Sometimes victory doesn't look like a banner or a stage. Sometimes it looks like waking up without dread, like laughing with your whole body, like looking in the mirror and not flinching. I turned 68 that November. Carol made her famous pecan pie. Raymond brought his new girlfriend, Lisa, a painter from Bowling Green, who smelled like lavender and wore bangles that clinked when she laughed. We sat around the table, and I looked at all the faces that had stayed, that had loved me when I didn't know how to love myself. After dinner, Carol handed me a small box. Inside was a silver bracelet. Engraved were the words, "Still here." I smiled, because I was. Still here. Still growing, still writing, still refusing to disappear. I never thought I would reach a point in my life where peace wasn't something I had to earn. For most of my years, I believed peace was a reward, something you had to prove you were worthy of after carrying pain like a cross on your back. I thought freedom meant forgetting. I thought healing meant pretending nothing had ever broken. But I was wrong. True peace I learned, is not the absence of memory. It's the courage to hold your memories and still move forward. And healing doesn't mean the cracks disappear. It means you build something beautiful in the spaces where the light comes through. Last year, Elias and I bought a small house in the hills just outside Asheville, North Carolina. It has a porch that wraps around like open arms and a view that turns every sunset into a quiet sermon. We planted sunflowers along the fence. They grew taller than the mailbox by July. Each morning I walk barefoot through the grass, coffee in hand, the cat trailing behind me like a silent companion. I'm 74 now. My hair is silver. My hands are worn, but they still write. I still wake before dawn to fill the pages of my journal with thoughts that feel too heavy to carry silently. And for the first time in my life, I don't write to be understood. I write because my voice matters, because silence is no longer my burden, because truth is no longer my shame. 2 months ago, I received a letter from a young woman named Ava, who found my book in a library in Colorado. She said she read it in one sitting, then cried in her car for 2 hours before calling her sister to say, "It wasn't your fault." She said it was the first time she'd spoken those words out loud. I sat with that letter for a long time, because Ava wasn't just a reader. She was me, 30 years ago, alone, afraid, waiting for someone to say, "I believe you." That's why I keep telling my story. Not because I enjoy reliving the pain, but because someone, somewhere, still thinks their pain is unspeakable. And if I can speak mine, maybe they'll believe theirs can be spoken too. I once asked Dr. Price, "What if my story doesn't matter to anyone?" She looked me in the eyes and said, "Your story mattered the moment you survived it." That sentence has stayed with me more than anything else. It echoed in my chest the day I stood in front of a church congregation in Tennessee, reading from my book, as women wept and men stared at their shoes. It hummed like a heartbeat the day I was invited to a high school to speak about consent and self-worth, and a girl no older than 16 came up to me after and said, "I thought I was crazy, but now I know I'm not." It rang loudest the day I returned to Harlan. Yes, I went back. I needed to. Carol came with me. We drove past the gas station, the rusted playground, the bakery that had closed years ago. When we pulled up in front of the house on Birch Street, my breath caught in my throat. It looked smaller, empty. The windows boarded up, the paint chipped, the garden gone to weeds. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I stood on the sidewalk and whispered, "I forgive you." Not for him, not for my mother, but for me, because I couldn't carry it anymore. I left a single flower on the step. Then we drove away, and I didn't look back. Now every Sunday evening, I sit on my porch and light a candle, not for mourning, for honoring, for remembering the girl who once begged God to take her away and thanking Him for not listening. For every woman who has lived through silence and decided to speak anyway. For every child who thought pain was their destiny and lived long enough to rewrite the ending. If you are still reading, I want you to hear this. You are not what happened to you. You are not the names they called you. You are not the fear they planted in your bones. You are not broken beyond repair. You are not alone. You are not too late. You are still here, still breathing, still worthy, still capable of joy that does not ask permission, still able to rewrite the story they tried to end. So I ask you now, with all the tenderness and truth I've gathered across a lifetime of survival, will you choose to stay? Will you choose to speak? Will you choose to live without apology? If this story touched your heart, if you saw yourself in my wounds or found hope in my healing, I ask you to leave a comment with the phrase, "I made it to the end because I believe in the power of truth," like this video. Share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe to this channel, not because of algorithms or numbers, but because this space is sacred, because here we tell the stories they tried to bury, because here you are seen, you are heard, you are held, and when you feel like you are alone in the dark, remember this: there is a porch somewhere, there is a candle burning, there is a woman who once believed her voice didn't matter, and now she speaks for both of you. This story is a work of original authorship, inspired by the silent testimonies of so many. No part of it was copied or borrowed. It was built from truth, memory, and soul, and it belongs to us, all of us, always.